King Solomon was not just a king, he became a legend. His name echoes through the centuries as a symbol of unparalleled wisdom, unimaginable wealth, and absolute power. From the moment he ascended to the throne of Israel, Solomon seemed destined for something far greater than any ordinary man. But his story goes beyond glory and accomplishments. It's a profound reflection on human frailty, pride, and the devastating consequences of turning away from God. Now, close your eyes for a moment and picture the young Solomon, newly crowned, bearing the responsibility of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. The weight of his father's legacy, the legendary King David, was almost overwhelming. Yet Solomon's heart sought something beyond power or riches. On an unforgettable night in Gibeon, God appeared to him in a dream, offering him something extraordinary. Ask for whatever you want, and I will give it to you. Stop and think for a moment. What would you ask for if the creator of the universe made such an offer? Many would wish for riches, long life, or victory over their enemies. But Solomon did something remarkable. He asked for wisdom, not for himself, but to lead with justice, to discern right from wrong, and to govern God's chosen people with a humble heart. Solomon's request pleased the Lord so much that God not only granted him unparalleled wisdom, but also poured out blessings of wealth, honor, and the promise of a long life, on the condition that Solomon remained faithful to God's commands. And so began a reign that promised to be one of the most extraordinary in history. Solomon's displays of wisdom soon became known throughout Israel and beyond. Who doesn't remember the famous story of the two women disputing the maternity of the same child? Solomon's judgment not only revealed the true mother, but also demonstrated wisdom that could only come from God. He proposed to divide the baby in two, knowing the genuine love of a mother would be revealed in her willingness to give up her child to save its life. This act not only ensured justice, but left the people in awe, recognizing that God had blessed their king with divine discernment. And this was just the beginning. Solomon's wisdom was described as more vast than the sands on the seashore, greater than all the sages of the East, and deeper than the knowledge of Egypt. He composed 3,000 proverbs and over 1,000 songs, exploring themes of life, nature, leadership, and faith. His fame spread so far that it reached the ears of the powerful Queen of Sheba, a renowned ruler who traveled great distances to test him with challenging questions. When she finally met Solomon, she was left speechless. "Not even half of what I heard does justice to your wisdom," she confessed. But Solomon's greatest legacy was not his wisdom recorded in words, nor the wealth he amassed. It was the temple he built in Jerusalem. Imagine it, a masterpiece of architecture, constructed with the finest cedar from Lebanon and adorned with gold, silver, and bronze. For 7 years, the people worked tirelessly to complete this sacred monument, a place where God's presence would dwell among his people. And on the day of its dedication, something extraordinary happened. As Solomon prayed with sincerity and reverence, the glory of God descended upon the temple, filling it with a cloud so dense that the priests could not perform their duties. It was a moment of awe, a powerful reminder that God was among his people. Under Solomon's rule, Israel flourished. The kingdom became a center of trade, culture, and influence, attracting merchants, scholars, and rulers from every corner of the ancient world. Wealth flowed like rivers throughout the land. Gold was abundant, while silver was so common it was considered worthless. And Solomon's throne? A spectacle in itself, made of ivory and overlaid with pure gold, with 12 majestic lions adorning its steps, a symbol of the unmatched supremacy and glory of his reign. But the higher you rise, the greater the fall. Solomon, with all his wisdom and power, was about to tread a dangerous path that would change not only his life, but the destiny of Israel forever. Despite all the splendor of his kingdom and the depth of his wisdom, something began to shift in Solomon. At the peak of his glory, he started walking a path of dangerous compromises, driven by decisions that slowly eroded the spiritual foundation sustaining his life. Over time, his pursuit of prosperity and influence led him to forge alliances with other nations, many sealed through marriages to foreign women. What initially seemed like a strategic political move soon revealed itself to be one of the greatest tragedies of his story. The book of 1 Kings tells us that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. These weren't just impressive numbers. Each of these women represented a connection to peoples and cultures that did not worship the God of Israel. Against God's clear warnings, Solomon married women from the Moabites, Ammonites, Sidonians, and Hittites, nations the Lord had specifically forbidden the Israelites to intermarry with. These marital alliances, instead of strengthening the kingdom, began to weaken Solomon's devotion to the Lord. Like a small deviation at the start of a journey can completely change its destination, Solomon started opening his heart to foreign gods. As Solomon grew older, his faithfulness to the God who had given him everything began to fade. Influenced by his wives, he not only allowed the construction of altars to pagan gods, but even participated in their worship. He built altars for Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Chemosh, the god of the Moabites. Perhaps the most shocking was the altar dedicated to Molech, the god of the Ammonites, whose worship included detestable practices like child sacrifice. These actions were not mere cultural compromises. They were outright betrayals of the covenant Solomon had made with God, a covenant reinforced with unparalleled blessings and clear warnings. The impact of these choices was not just personal. They placed the entire nation of Israel at spiritual risk. Solomon, the man who had led the construction of the Lord's temple, was now participating in rituals at pagan altars. The temple, which was meant to be the center of worship for the one true God, was overshadowed by these places of idolatry. The king's heart, once fully devoted to God, became divided, and the people who followed him began to reflect that same division. God did not remain silent in the face of Solomon's disobedience. The same Lord who appeared to him in dreams and granted him unparalleled wisdom now warned him again. In 1 Kings 9, God made it clear that if Solomon or his descendants turned away from his commands and followed other gods, the consequences would be devastating. He promised that Israel would be uprooted from the land God had given them, and that the temple, this masterpiece representing the covenant between God and his people, would be rejected and reduced to ruins. Yet, these warnings were not enough to turn Solomon back. And so the story that began with so much promise and potential began to veer off course. The wisdom that God had given Solomon to discern right from wrong seemed obscured by his pursuit of pleasure, power, and acceptance. He started ignoring the very advice he had once written in Proverbs: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." The inner division in Solomon's heart was a reflection of a kingdom that was also starting to fracture. Although the kingdom of Israel was still at the height of its prosperity and influence, invisible cracks began to form. Solomon's leadership, once marked by absolute dependence on God, was now corroded by spiritual compromises that affected not only himself, but the entire nation. The king's decisions were not merely personal, they shaped the future of Israel, a future that under God's wrath was about to change irreversibly. By the end of this dark period, Solomon was no longer the same man who had humbly asked for wisdom to govern his people. His heart, once filled with reverence and obedience, was now tainted by idolatry and the desire to please those around him, rather than remain faithful to the God who had given him everything. Solomon's disobedience set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the division of Israel and the loss of the divine blessing that had defined the early years of his reign. And as the story moves forward, we find a king who is about to face the consequences of his choices. The path he chose to walk would not only alter the course of his life, but also forever change the destiny of the nation he was called to lead. As the years passed, what began as small compromises in Solomon's heart transformed into a complete departure from the purpose he had been called to fulfill. The young king, who once impressed God with his humility, now found himself trapped by his own decisions. His political alliances, sealed through marriages to foreign women, became a burden he could no longer bear. These women, with their pagan traditions and beliefs, brought not only foreign gods to Israel, but also the corrosive influence of cultures that directly contradicted the Lord's commands. Picture Solomon, seated on his golden throne, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, and yet spiritually empty. He had everything a man could desire: power, fame, wisdom, and riches beyond human comprehension. But behind the facade of glory was a man who had lost his connection with the God who had given him all of it. His choices not only distanced him from God, but also began to erode the spiritual foundations of Israel. The kingdom that had once thrived under divine blessing now faced the looming shadow of judgment. The book of 1 Kings gives us a chilling glimpse into the consequences of this departure. God, who had appeared to Solomon on 2 occasions to reaffirm his covenant, now pronounced judgment. In 1 Kings 11, we read that the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away. The man who built the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, the center of worship for the one true God, was now involved in the construction of altars for Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Molech. These altars were not just symbols of disobedience, but also promoted detestable practices like human sacrifice. God's anger toward Solomon was not light. The Lord declared that the kingdom would be torn from his hands, a severe but just judgment. However, out of love for David, his father, God decided to delay this sentence until after Solomon's death. This was not only an act of mercy, but also a reminder of God's faithfulness to his promises, even when his people failed to keep their part. The prophecy was clear. The kingdom would be divided, and the unity of Israel achieved with such effort would be destroyed. Solomon knew this. He felt the weight of judgment approaching. But instead of repenting and returning to the Lord, he seemed to sink further into his destructive decisions. His wealth, which had once been a blessing, became a burden. He had accumulated so much gold and silver that he lost sight of the value of things. Everything he built, everything he acquired, seemed like a desperate attempt to fill a void that only God could satisfy. At this point in the narrative, we are reminded that no matter how much someone achieves in worldly terms, whether wealth, wisdom, or power, these things can never replace an intimate relationship with God. Solomon's heart was divided, and a divided heart cannot please God. In Deuteronomy 17, God had instructed that the kings of Israel should not accumulate excessive wealth, horses, or wives, as these could lead their hearts astray. Solomon ignored all these warnings. He amassed horses from various nations, strengthened his army beyond what was necessary, and accumulated so much wealth that silver became trivial. But it was the multiplication of wives and his spiritual compromise that sealed his downfall. And yet Solomon seemed unable to stop. The more he built, the more alliances he forged, the further he drifted from God. The temple he had constructed to be a place of worship and sacrifice to the Lord became just another symbol of his achievements, overshadowed by the altars dedicated to pagan gods. The king's heart grew hardened, and his wisdom, the gift that once defined his greatness, was entirely obscured by his disobedience. The impact of this on the people of Israel was devastating. Idolatry, which had been carefully eradicated by David and other faithful leaders, began to spread once again. The Israelites looked to their king's example and saw tacit permission to mix the worship of the Lord with pagan practices. The nation that had been chosen to be a light to others now stumbled into the darkness of idolatry, led by a ruler who had abandoned his first love. Yet even in the midst of this bleak scenario, God remained faithful to his word. Amid the growing darkness, he raised prophets to warn and correct Israel's path. One of these prophets, Ahijah, received a clear vision of what was to come. He encountered Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials, and tore his cloak into 12 pieces, giving 10 to Jeroboam as a symbol that he would rule over 10 tribes of Israel. This dramatic act was a foreshadowing of the kingdom's division, a reminder that God is sovereign even when man fails. Solomon, the man who had once dedicated his life to the Lord, was now witnessing the beginning of the end of his reign. His days of glory seemed increasingly distant, and the weight of his wrong choices began to crush him. He knew that his legacy would be tarnished, that the kingdom he had governed with such wisdom would be divided and marked by conflict. And so, as Solomon aged, he began to reflect on his life. The man who once wrote that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom now lived with the consequences of abandoning that fear. His final days were marked by deep sorrow, a late realization that no amount of wealth, power, or pleasure could substitute obedience to God. And yet, even in this moment of darkness, powerful lessons were being taught. The importance of remaining faithful, the futility of seeking fulfillment in worldly things, and the necessity of a heart fully devoted to the Lord. Solomon was about to face his darkest moment, a moment that would not only mark the end of his life, but also leave a legacy of warning for all of us who struggle with the same desires and temptations. In his later years, Solomon became a man haunted by his own choices. The greatness that once defined his life now felt like an unbearable burden. The king, who had spent his youth seeking God's wisdom, now found himself lost, isolated in a maze of regrets. His wealth, once a testament to divine blessing, now served as a constant reminder of his failure to remain faithful to the Lord. And so he began to reflect on the course of his life, his achievements, and most importantly, his mistakes. These deep reflections became evident in the book of Ecclesiastes attributed to Solomon's later years. There, we see a man who had experienced everything this world has to offer and still concluded that it was all vanity. Vanity of vanities, he wrote, everything is vanity. These words were not just a philosophical observation. They were a cry of despair from someone who had strayed from his true source of purpose and meaning. Solomon recognized that, without God, everything he had accumulated, his wisdom, his wealth, his accomplishments, was like chasing after the wind. He recalled the years of his youth when God first appeared to him in a dream and granted him the wisdom that defined the early part of his reign. He thought of the day he dedicated the temple in Jerusalem, when the glory of God descended like a cloud and filled that holy place. But those moments of intimacy with the Lord now felt distant, overshadowed by the years of idolatry and disobedience that followed. Solomon's heart, once filled with fervor and devotion, had grown cold and divided. Imagine the king, sitting in his palace, surrounded by incomparable riches, yet consumed by a sense of emptiness. He had amassed enough gold to make silver seem worthless, controlled trade routes that brought exotic treasures from distant lands, and ruled a kingdom whose fame had spread throughout the ancient world. And yet, all of it seemed insignificant under the weight of his separation from God. He wrote, "Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied." This late realization reflected a life spent seeking fulfillment in worldly things rather than in God. But Solomon's regret wasn't just about what he had lost personally. He knew that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond his own life. The kingdom of Israel, united and prosperous under his rule, was now on the brink of division. The idolatry he had introduced, the pagan altars he had permitted and even encouraged, had contaminated God's people. The nation that was meant to be an example to the world was now becoming more and more like the nations around it, adopting their practices and abandoning the Lord. Ahijah's prophecy to Jeroboam was a harsh blow to Solomon. He knew the kingdom would be divided after his death, with only a small portion remaining under his lineage, and that solely because of God's faithfulness to his covenant with David. Solomon tried to resist this fate, pursuing Jeroboam and attempting to eliminate the threat. But it was too late. God had already decreed the judgment, and nothing Solomon did could reverse it. These final years of Solomon's life were marked by an internal struggle. He knew he had failed as Israel's spiritual leader, as a father, and as a servant of God. He wrote in Ecclesiastes, "I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind." This confession was a bitter acknowledgement that the things he had valued most, wealth, pleasure, power, held no lasting significance without God. Even in his wisdom, Solomon was blind to the most important truth until it was too late. The true purpose of life is not found in personal accomplishments, but in a faithful relationship with the Creator. He wrote, "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." These final words from Ecclesiastes read like the testament of a man who finally understood what truly mattered, though he lamented learning the lessons so late. As Solomon faced the final days of his life, he was acutely aware that his story would serve as a warning to future generations. He knew his downfall would stand as a somber reminder of what happens when one places their heart in the things of this world instead of in the Lord. Solomon, the wisest man of all time, had allowed his wisdom to be overshadowed by his passions and desires. He traded obedience for indulgence, devotion for compromise, and blessing for judgment. And so the king who began his reign with promises of glory and divine favor faced his last moments as a man broken and repentant. He had experienced the best this world had to offer, but all of it paled in comparison to the realization that his true wealth lay in the relationship he had neglected with God. His life, so full of potential, had become a cautionary tale for all of us. What remained of Solomon was not his treasures or achievements, but the powerful lesson that true wisdom lies in remaining faithful to the Lord until the end. Solomon knew he could not change the past, but perhaps in his final words, he could guide others to avoid making the same mistakes. And as he reflected on his life and his legacy, one question lingered in his mind. Had it all been in vain? In the final days of his life, Solomon was no longer the vibrant, energetic man who had ascended to the throne of Israel. Years of excess, spiritual compromises, and poor decisions had left deep marks on his soul and body. The king who had once ruled with divine wisdom now lived enveloped in regret, reflecting on all he had lost over the course of his life. The weight of his disobedience was not just a personal matter. It was a burden that affected the entire nation, threatening the future of Israel as a united and blessed kingdom. Picture Solomon in his magnificent palace surrounded by gold, marble, and treasures from distant lands. The opulence around him could not mask the reality of his inner state. Despite being surrounded by servants eager to attend to him, musicians ready to entertain, and wives vying for his favor, he felt overwhelmingly alone. His mind was filled with images of the past, moments of glory and closeness to God that now seemed as distant as the lands from which his luxuries had come. The weight of his choices loomed over him like a shadow. He vividly remembered the days when God's presence was evident in his life. How could he forget the moment, as a young man, when God appeared to him in a dream, offering him anything his heart desired? He asked for wisdom, and with it, not only received divine discernment, but also wealth and glory beyond human comprehension. Yet the wisdom that defined his youth now seemed to have vanished under the weight of his passions. He had traded the simplicity of obedience for the complications brought by wealth and worldly pleasures. As Solomon reflected, he thought of the temple he had built, a monumental work, the pinnacle of his dedication to God, intended to be the place where the Lord would dwell among his people. He remembered the day of the temple's dedication, when the glory of God descended like a cloud, filling the temple and leaving everyone present in deep reverence. On that day, he had prayed with all the fervor of his heart, asking God to hear the prayers offered there and to protect Israel forever. But now he could barely face the thought that this sacred temple had been overshadowed by the altars he himself had permitted, altars erected to pagan gods that had turned not only his heart but also the hearts of the people away from God. These altars, symbols of his disobedience, served as constant reminders of how he had allowed idolatry to infiltrate Israel. Solomon saw himself as directly responsible for the spiritual corruption of his people. He knew that by turning away from God, he had set a terrible example, encouraging the Israelites to follow the same path. What should have been a kingdom of holiness, where worship of the Lord was central, had now been stained by the worship of Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Molech. Worse still, he knew that God was angry with him. The Lord, who had warned him on 2 occasions, had now pronounced judgment on his kingdom, promising to divide Israel as a consequence of his unfaithfulness. Solomon also reflected on his family and the legacy he would leave behind. He was fully aware that his son and successor, Rehoboam, would inherit a kingdom on the verge of collapse. He knew Rehoboam lacked the wisdom and strength necessary to keep the kingdom united amid internal and external pressures. This reality pained Solomon deeply, as he understood that Israel's future divisions were the direct result of his own sins. God's promise that the kingdom would be torn from his dynasty, though only partially, was like an open wound in his heart. But it was not only the future of his family and nation that haunted him. Solomon wrestled with the profound spiritual emptiness growing inside him. He had experienced every pleasure the world could offer. He had built grand palaces, planted vineyards and gardens, amassed incalculable wealth, and enjoyed the company of hundreds of wives and concubines. Yet all of it felt meaningless. He wrote, "I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind." These words were not just a confession. They were the cry of a man who recognized he had erred in seeking satisfaction in earthly things, rather than remaining faithful to the Lord. Solomon's regret was profound, but the time to correct his mistakes had passed. He knew he could not undo the altars he had built or restore the hearts of the people of Israel to the Lord. His actions had set into motion a chain of events that would culminate in the division of the kingdom and the loss of divine blessing. Even so, amid the darkness of his final days, Solomon found enough clarity to leave a warning for future generations. In Ecclesiastes, he wrote, "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." These words, so simple and direct, carried the weight of a lifetime of mistakes and lessons learned the hard way. He recognized, perhaps too late, that true wisdom was not found in accumulating knowledge, wealth, or pleasures, but in a faithful relationship with God. Solomon knew the end was near. His health was failing, and the vitality of his youth had faded. He was now a broken man, both physically and spiritually. But in his final days, as he looked back with eyes full of regret, he also looked to the future with a glimmer of hope, that his final words might help others avoid making the same mistakes. He wanted Israel, even after its fall, to remember that the Lord is faithful and just, and that there is always redemption for those who turn back to him. And so, in the twilight of his life, Solomon was no longer the wise and powerful king the world admired. He was simply a man, aware of his fallibility and desperate for meaning in a world he had sought to master, but that now mastered him. His final words would become his legacy, an echo of warning and hope that would transcend time. Yet, as the end approached, Solomon could not avoid one last burning question in his heart. Had he lost what truly mattered? As Solomon's final days drew to a close, he could not escape the weight of his decisions. Every detail of his life seemed to replay in his mind, as if he were trying to find logic, a meaning to everything he had done. But the reality was inevitable. His, which began with such promise, was marked by choices that would echo far beyond his own life. He knew that just as he had allowed his heart to stray, the people of Israel had followed that path, resulting in the fragmentation of the kingdom he had worked so hard to build. In his solitude, Solomon likely heard echoes of what was once one of the greatest blessings of his life, God's promise that he would be a wise and prosperous king as long as he remained faithful. He remembered God's clear words, deeply engraved in his memory. "If you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life." But Solomon did not walk in the ways of the Lord. He had allowed pride, power, and worldly pleasures to pull him away from the one who had given him everything. Now, at the end of his life, Solomon was surrounded by all he had achieved, and yet he had nothing. His palace, a marvel of the ancient world, felt empty. The wealth that flowed endlessly into Israel's treasury brought him no comfort. He knew that without God, it was all meaningless. "Everything is vanity," he had written in Ecclesiastes. This conclusion was more than a reflection. It was a verdict on a life spent chasing something that could never satisfy. Looking back, Solomon understood that his downfall did not happen suddenly. It was a slow process, a small departure from God that over time became an unbridgeable chasm. He had been warned repeatedly, both by God and by his own conscience. But, as happens with many of us, he ignored the signs, believing he could balance his devotion to God with the pleasures and commitments the world offered. He discovered, too late, that one cannot serve two masters. The tragedy of Solomon was not just his fall, but the impact of that fall on his people and his family. He knew that because of his choices, the kingdom would be divided. The prophet Ahijah had already delivered the message to Jeroboam, and Solomon in his final days understood that he was leaving his son Rehoboam a legacy of division and conflict. He knew God's judgment was just, but that did not lessen the pain of knowing he had failed in his responsibility as God's chosen leader. Solomon also reflected on the impact of his idolatry. The altars he built to please his foreign wives were not merely monuments of disobedience. They were symbols of how he had betrayed the God who had called him. He knew these altars would continue to ensnare the people of Israel, leading them away from worshiping the one true God. He realized he had sown seeds of idolatry that would take generations to uproot. Yet, even amid this darkness, Solomon found enough clarity to leave a spiritual legacy. He knew he could not change the past, but he could share the lessons he had learned from his mistakes. In his final recorded words, he sought to impart the wisdom he had gained at such great cost. "Fear God and keep his commandments," he wrote, "for this is the duty of all mankind." It was a simple yet powerful message, a summary of everything he had come to understand. Solomon recognized that, in the end, what mattered was not the wealth he had accumulated, the magnificent buildings he had erected, or even the fame he had achieved. What truly mattered was his relationship with God, a relationship he had neglected in pursuit of things that could never fill the emptiness in his soul. He knew he had squandered precious opportunities, and that regret weighed heavily on him in his final days. And so, as Solomon reflected on his life, he realized that his story was about more than just himself. It was a warning to all who would come after him, a reminder that even the wisest and most blessed can fall if they turn away from God. He knew his legacy would be twofold. On one hand, a testament to how abundantly God can bless those who follow him. On the other, a warning about the consequences of straying from the path of obedience. Solomon died knowing that his kingdom was destined to be divided, that his wealth and buildings would eventually be destroyed, and that his people would face centuries of spiritual and political struggles. But above all, he knew that God was faithful even when he had not been. And perhaps in his final moments, he found a glimpse of peace, trusting that God, in his mercy, would use even his downfall to teach and redeem. And so the wisest king in history came to the end of his life, not in a glorious triumph, but in a silence filled with reflection and regret. His final legacy was an eternal lesson. True wisdom is not in accumulating wealth, power, or pleasure, but in fearing God and keeping his commandments. Solomon was gone, but his words would echo for generations, reminding us that in the end, only God can fill the emptiness in our hearts. Solomon's final days were marked by a stillness that stood in stark contrast to the glory and busyness of his years on the throne. The king who had built the most magnificent temple Israel had ever seen, who had ruled over a kingdom at the height of its prosperity, and whose wisdom had drawn rulers from distant lands, now sat alone, surrounded by the memories of his failures. He knew the end was near, not only of his life, but of the united kingdom he had once governed. And yet, it was in these final moments that Solomon found clarity, a late understanding of what truly mattered. He recalled the days of his youth when everything seemed possible. He had been chosen by God, set apart for a purpose that would transcend his own life. He remembered the temple, that monumental structure representing God's presence among his people. Solomon had prayed fervently on the day of its dedication, asking God to hear the prayers of the people of Israel, to forgive their sins, and to remain with them forever. But now he knew he had failed to honor that sacred commitment. He had allowed pagan altars to be built, abominable practices like human sacrifice to occur under his supervision, and the hearts of the people to be led astray from God. Looking back, Solomon recognized how small compromises could lead to great tragedies. At first, marrying foreign women seemed like wise political decisions, strengthening alliances with other nations. But over time, these relationships brought destructive spiritual influences. He not only permitted his wives to worship their own gods, but also joined them, building altars and participating in pagan rituals. These actions were not merely acts of personal disobedience. They were a direct insult to the God who had blessed him with everything he had. The words of God, spoken to him at the height of his life, now echoed in his mind. "If you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe my commands, I will cut Israel off from the land I have given them." Solomon knew these words would come to pass. He knew his son Rehoboam would face the consequences of his sins, inheriting a divided and spiritually weakened kingdom. This hurt him deeply, for he understood that while God was faithful to his promises, human actions carried weight and consequences. As Solomon reflected on his life, he also looked to the writings he had left behind. His Proverbs, filled with divine wisdom, now felt ironically distant from the life he had led. He had advised others to trust in the Lord with all their heart and lean not on their own understanding, yet he had ignored that very counsel. He had warned against the love of money, saying it never satisfies, but he had spent years accumulating wealth that now seemed worthless. Yet, in the midst of the darkness of his regrets, Solomon found something he could still offer: his story. He knew that while he could not change his past, he could use his life as a warning for others. And so he wrote words that would echo for generations: "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." These words, simple yet powerful, are Solomon's final legacy. They remind us that true wisdom is not found in the pursuit of wealth, pleasures, or power, but in living a life of reverence to God. When Solomon took his final breath, he left behind a kingdom that was rich but divided, a legacy of greatness but also of warnings. His story is not just about a king, but about the universal struggle between God's call and the temptations of the world. It challenges us to look at our own lives and ask, are we putting God first, or are we letting distractions and worldly desires pull us away from Him? And now we want to speak to you who have joined us on this journey. Has Solomon's story touched something within you? Perhaps you are facing choices that seem small now but could have significant consequences in the future. Perhaps you are seeking fulfillment in things that can never truly satisfy. Solomon's story invites us to reflect, to reevaluate our priorities, and to turn to God with a sincere heart. If this video has brought value to your life, we invite you to join us in our mission to share stories like this, stories that inspire, challenge, and transform. Please like this video, subscribe to the Eternal Compass, and click the bell to stay connected with content that brings us closer to the true purpose of life. But more than that, we want to hear from you. In the comments, share what impacted you the most about Solomon's life. Was it his wisdom, his failures, or the lessons he learned too late? Your comment could inspire someone else and open a conversation that has the power to change lives. And please share this video with someone you believe needs to hear this message. It could be a friend, a family member, or even someone struggling with the same temptations Solomon faced. Remember, stories like this have the power to transform lives, and you could be the messenger. Thank you for joining us on this journey. May Solomon's story serve as a compass, guiding you toward a deeper relationship with God. And never forget, the true treasure of life is living for Him. We'll see you in the next video here on the Eternal Compass.